Welcome to the Marshall Pruitt Podcast, our Week in IndyCar series presented by Cooper Tires. Got a really fun episode for you if you are looking to learn more about the art and science of race tires and open wheel competition. Our guest, Cara Adams, Firestone's chief race tire engineer, designer, manager, etc. She'll be coming on, and we had a blast. We recorded this towards the end of the day on Tuesday with her. It's meant to be about 45 minutes, but we ended up having so many awesome questions that came in via Facebook, Twitter, and Reddit. She gave us some overtime here, about half an hour, so just stayed late at work. And again, anytime she and I get to speak, it's awesome. But anytime she's able to set aside a good block, good chunk here to answer questions, educate me on some things. I might be an old race engineer, but things fall out of my brain. But to also bring IndyCar fans more up to speed on the technical side, or just answer some things that were curiosities. She's truly one of the best, and that's why she has been doing such an amazing job in this role since she took over from her predecessor Dale Harrigal. We'll kick off, before we get to Cara, we'll kick off with a couple of newsy items. Our weekly TorontoMotorsports.com t-shirt winner, and also the questions that you sent in dedicated just for little old me. We'll go first with something that, again, this is certainly first world problems. You might have a feel for my sensibilities, humor, and the silly and the asinine. They are just always things that either stand out to me or I'm looking for. And we definitely have one this week. Meaningless in the scope of the world, but could not avoid the mild hilarity that Santino Ferrucci, who we've been saying here for the past couple of weeks, have been waiting for the confirmation at Dale Coyne Racing. Santino was finally confirmed Tuesday morning as Dale Coyne Racing's new full-time driver. Although Sebastian Bourdais wasn't mentioned in any of this, we know that Seb will be back to lead the team. How did we learn this? Where did we learn this? Well, it wasn't from Dale Coyne Racing. It was from Santino's new management team that put out a release saying they had signed the kid. Oh, and by the way, he'll be full-time with Dale Coyne. Almost 2 hours later, to the minute, Dale Coyne Racing sent out a release stating that Santino would be driving for them full-time. And I know the kid certainly is one who, if there is blame to apportion, some folks are definitely wanting to make sure that he is the center of that blame. There's no way that he's at fault for this one. Just knowing how these things work, he wouldn't be the one to hit send on the press release. Just say that if you have a new management team and that management team wants to announce they've signed you, that's great. It's a great announcement. Send it out. We get those all the time. When you also take the extra step of telling the team's business before the team, I assume without their blessing. I know without their blessing, but I'll just say assume without their blessing. Maybe not getting off on the right foot there, old new management team. So, yeah, I felt bad for the kid. I also felt bad for Dale Coyne Racing, knowing that obviously Dale was wanting to sit on this for a little bit and tell this news when he was in the mood, and they apparently had to scramble to put out their own release to confirm their news. That wasn't Santino's management team's news to break. But again, first world problems, but just you look and see how things play out, and you're like, oh man, that's really not how you would want things to go if you had a choice. Alexander Rossi, I know, caught a lot of folks' attention last weekend. The Baja 1000, not only did it appear that, as you would expect from someone with that much talent, he plugged right in and was just an equal among veterans in off-road racing, but also had that scary moment when someone rather obliviously decided to drive counter course in their Jeep, and boy, that became a viral sensation rather quickly. Also had some folks ask, what we would like to see Alexander do in the future with other stuff. That's one of the questions that y'all have for me, so I'll get to that in a minute. But I love the idea of IndyCar drivers doing fun stuff in the off-season that isn't just the expected, hey, we're going to go do sports car stuff, endurance racing. That's great. Don't want that to change. But I love this very, very outside-the-box approach. So, I don't know. Maybe some ice racing or something else, we should think of some more fun things for drivers to do. So we recorded this Tuesday evening with Cara. I'm doing the cold open here Wednesday morning just due to the way time worked out. Just filed a story as well, which I won't go into it too heavily here because it'll be sitting on racer.com by the time you hear this, but our friends at the Harding-Steinbrenner team, one that obviously coming off of a just pure Mike Harding-owned effort through 2018, being relaunched as Harding-Steinbrenner next year with Pato O'Ward, our new Indy Lights champ, his teammate runner-up Colton Herta. Heard some unexpected rumors that I am fairly confident in saying they aren't just rumors. They haven't been acknowledged by the team, but acknowledgement of something doesn't mean that it isn't true. That they've been going through some, I don't want to say financial hardships, but the money that had been expected to be coming in, flowing in, new relationships forged, new partnerships signed, that might not be going as well as anticipated. We're talking now, late November, so it's not as if we are rolling into St. Petersburg next week for the season opener, but I can say that a surprise in the sense that with all of the names involved, the Andretti Autosport team, Mike Harding, an existing program, they've hired more folks this year to help on the marketing and sponsor acquisition side, plus the Steinbrenners. You would think that by this stage of the off-season, the team would not be sitting idle, doing nothing, waiting for money to come in for them to act. And we have time. There is time. And I think we would all obviously hope that something extremely positive is going to start ramping up. Money will start coming in. Businesses will start signing on. Sponsors, super delighted. Business-to-business deals and such. Would also look at a kid like Pato O'Ward from Mexico. Huge personality, lots of fun. Elio Castroneves 2.0 also, could potentially be the one giant connection from IndyCar to Spanish-speaking United States, Latin America, you name it. This kid, I think, is someone who should have a lot of companies already behind him and supporting him. Heard a couple of things that there might be some positive traction there. Hasn't been fully realized, but positive movement in that area, just not there yet. Have heard maybe a little bit less on the Colton side in terms of sponsors coming in ready to jump in. I know that's where the Steinbrenner connection was really expected to pay off. So not making any claims. Still know that we've got 3-4 months for all this to come together. Teams are going to start testing in early January, though, and you don't want to be the one sitting on the sidelines as your rivals are out learning and getting better prepared for the new season while you're sitting home and essentially learning nothing and losing ground before the first lap of official practice has ever been turned. So, clock is definitely ticking there, and I think if we all had sponsor leads, we'd be sending them their way and saying, hey, talk to them, there's $200,000 here and there's $1 million there. Fairly confident they will get something together and that the program as announced with the number 8 and the number 88 will be on track when we do get to St. Petersburg. Just higher tensions right now, I think, than anyone anticipated. We'll mention a quick get well to a pal of IndyCar and a pal of the industry, Sean Belby, coordinating producer for most of the IndyCar broadcasts you'll watch. He's also the direct producer for the majority of the Indy Lights races, where you will have heard our pal Kevin Lee, Anders Krohn, and myself as a color analyst for about half of the races. Last couple of seasons, Sean has been stricken with a quick illness, if you want to call it that, so we're hoping he'll be back to full strength here very soon. But nonetheless, when we hear about our man Sean, who's just genuinely a good guy, takes care of so many of us, you hate to hear that he's having to take a knee for just a little bit. Also mention a fellow Cooper-sponsored friend here, someone a part of the same family, Dave Duzick, who not only does many things in the sport, but is also growing his role in race control as well. Dave is having his annual Racers Know Dave Duzick Foundation charity event. That is December 6th, the day before I turned 48. Good Lord. Dave is having his latest charity event in Indianapolis right around the launch of the PRI show. So this will be their 4th annual event. Everything that they do there, it's on the 4th floor of the Media Center, by the way, at PRI, but everything they do at the event, all the money that is brought in, 100% of the donations that come in from ticket sales and such, all goes to the Dave Duzick Foundation, and that money is sent directly to the Riley Hospital for Children in Indianapolis. So if you are a fan of Dave, if you're familiar with this, even if you are not, would definitely recommend. This is just one of those good things being done by an incredibly good guy to try and raise money to help kids, to help folks in need in and around a bit of a celebration event. So those doors open at 7, silent auction, there's bar and food, live music. There's going to be some familiar faces there. Charlie Kimball will turn up. Max Pappas will be there, and his wife Katie Hargett, announcer Tony Laporta and such. So music, food, some fun personalities. Kimball and Pappas. Now that sounds like polar opposites right there, but that's usually where you get some fun. So if you get a chance, if you're interested, you can learn more about this. If you're in and around the general Indianapolis area, you can do worse things and go and spend an evening supporting Dave and his charity and what they're trying to do for the Riley Kids Hospital on December 6th. So again, if you are interested, you can check out the Dave Duzick, D-U-S-I-C-K, DaveDuzickFoundation.org, or you can hit Dave up on Twitter at I Know Dave Duzick. He's on Instagram and Facebook. Not hard to find. Super awesome guy. And so, yeah, if you get a chance, go check it out and have a little bit of fun. Buy a ticket and know that you are contributing to good things. Speaking of good things, I love the question last week sent in by Don Gregory, where Oriole Survey was our guest. And Don asked, can you talk about the frustration you felt having your win at the 2011 Loudon IndyCar race in New Hampshire stripped away after leading the race when it was red flagged, only to have the results reversed and the win given to Ryan Hunter-Reay? And so that led to really fun discussion, some very honest and frank moments from Oriole talking about how the outcome there really set their two careers on very different paths. So love that one, Don. Courtesy of our friends at TorontoMotorsports.com. Hit me with a direct message, give me your address and your t-shirt size, and our pal Derek Koska at TorontoMotorsports.com will send you a Week in IndyCar t-shirt that has my ugly mug on it. So that's all that stuff. I'm going to get to the questions you've sent in for me. I'm going to kick off here with Ryan Gamber, who asks, I'm curious why NASCAR routinely has tire failures, while other series do not. Is it related to tire construction, pressures, team settings of camber or toe, or something else? Can't really give you a hard single answer, Ryan. I'll offer maybe the most obvious one. If you look at 40-ish stock cars going around and around and around, the fact that they make contact on a regular basis, just the sheer volume of cars, the amount of potential debris coming off the cars, and the amount of laps that they turn, how long the races happen to be, I'd just say the numbers tell us the amount of tire failures that happen through punctures of things that they've run over, from contact. We might not always see that contact shown on the TV, side to side, or body panel pushed in. At least for me, I'm not surprised by whatever frequency of punctures that we have. Again, just knowing that this pack of cars or multiple packs of cars are circulating in or around the entire track. Folks that love to run the high line, like a Kyle Larson, others who are hugging the bottom, folks in between. It's not a case where, in most instances, we have a single groove on most of the tracks. I know that some of the short tracks, you get most folks diving towards the bottom, more often than not, but I think it's just a numbers thing, Ryan. I really do. If we're talking about, and there's really a bad batch of tires that came out, and they're all failing just out of nowhere, that would certainly raise some separate articles in and of themselves. Let's go to Leonard. Next, Leonard PDX. I'm guessing you're from Portland. If not, then I would love to know the PDX part. Leonard, if Penske decided to start constructing his own chassis again, would he be allowed to under the current rules, or is Dallara locked in for the foreseeable future? You have got it with the latter portion of that, Leonard. Dallara is indeed the sole supplier of chassis to IndyCar. They've had a couple of contract extensions, so prior to the new chassis that we believe will be here in 2022, it will be pure Dallara. And if there's maybe a follow-up question, do we think there's going to be multiple chassis coming into play for 2022? I'm very positive IndyCar will speak with multiple manufacturers to see what they have to offer. I absolutely do not expect anything to change in terms of having a single spec supplier for the cars that replace the aging Dallara DW12. I would also, at this early stage on November 21st, be willing to put down a wager of, I don't know, 10 grand, that if it isn't Dallara chosen to build the 2022 car, then, boy, I am truly losing my touch. So, nope, unfortunately, Penske and others cannot build prior to 2022, and I don't foresee anyone other than Dallara being chosen to build the next wave of cars. Let's go to John Sable next. Hey, John. In the aftermath of the massive Formula 3 crash at Macau over the weekend, I learned that the cars had a safety update in 2017. Do we know if any of those improvements came via the IndyCar program at Dallara? He says the performance of the car in the crash was tremendous. Tried to get an answer for you, John. I don't know if this is the exact answer, but with this being a little bit of a short week, I guess the main person who answers such things for me at Dallara, Stefano De Ponte, was not available when I rang him, and I haven't heard back in time before we started recording here. So next time I get a chance to catch up with Stefano, I will try and remember to pose this and get an answer for you. All right, and we're going to go to Cruel Monk. Always the best screen names come in from Reddit, and this does link in a little bit to the chassis topic. Any news on the next generation chassis, or if there's going to be another competition for the contract like last time? And also adds, since most motorsports like doing road relevancy ideas to help manufacturers, do you think IndyCar should look into using CVT, constantly variable transmission, in cars for the next generation chassis, but only at certain tracks? I'll go with the last part first, Cruel Monk, and say, CVT is not exactly dominating the automotive sector, so I think had this been years ago, maybe, when it was more of a newish technology and a newish rage, then maybe that might have been something to look into, but I think the bigger question of road relevancy, it's always going to hang over IndyCar's head. Especially in the super spec modern era, definitely over the last 15-ish years, 20 plus years. I mean, on the IRL side, we had multiple chassis, obviously had multiple engines. Most of the things on those cars were locked down in terms of development, but there was at least diversity compared to a single chassis supplier. But also now, in so many areas. I mean, I remember back in the day you would have multiple data system vendors, multiple everythings. You could do a lot of things how you wanted to. There was no spec supplier of seemingly every single system and component on the car like we have today. I think, the road relevancy side is really the bigger question that IndyCar is going to have to address. What they have planned for 2021 with the new 2.4 liter twin-turbo V6 engines, that's great. They want more power. The fast and loud formula that Jay Fry talks about, I love this. Love the idea. Love the sound. I've mentioned this before. I don't mind bringing it up again very quickly, but while I think many of us love the fast and loud mindset they're wanting to get back to, hopefully in 2022, to have a new chassis that's lighter than the current chassis, which would also add a lot more speed. All these things are going to happen, provided there are no major setbacks in those plans. Where you have to start questioning things, though, is you look at IMSA, which has 245 manufacturers involved. I can't count how many. You look in sports car racing, there's just huge amounts of manufacturers getting involved, not just the traditional ones though, and that's where high performance auto manufacturers have always played in sports cars. That's a natural link. I get that. I'm not saying that those numbers for those amount of manufacturers, that's something IndyCar's missing out on or doing wrong. By no means. What does interest me though is some of the new names where you go, so Hyundai is looking at a DPI program. Interesting. Wouldn't it be cheaper for them to do an IndyCar program? And they could. I'm not saying they won't, but just see some of the newer names or some of the more established names that are deciding to do new programs in motor racing. And I believe that the relevance side is definitely a big part of the equation. You could say the looks, sure. If you can race a prototype or a GT that looks like your road car, that's a great thing. Most manufacturers are going to choose that. But if we're talking about the ability to develop things in that car, whether it's a motor, whether it's electronics, other things that are truly cutting edge, and there's an ability to use IndyCar as a bit of a rolling test bed compared to all spec, all lockdown. Just saying that the chances of a greater number of manufacturers looking to IndyCar, they're going to be reduced if they're being given similar, if not slightly more open opportunities in other racing series. So that's the big one that stands out. Coming back to the multiple chassis side, I'd say that's going to be an interesting one as well in the next year and a half, because compared to the last time that IndyCar went through this process, and we had a bunch of, call it new manufacturers, or little mini conglomerations of Bruce Ashmore and Alan Mertens and so wanting to get together, and Gilles de Ferran proposed one, working with this constructor, and this here and that there. I think over the approximately 10 years that will have passed since the, quote, iconic committee did this investigation into potential chassis suppliers and chose Dallara, I think we're going to find out that there are not nearly as many manufacturers left or willing to put their name into the ring to try and do this. So just also maybe a bit of a sign of the times that smaller boutique constructors, I don't think would really find as much interest in trying to come together to do a 2022 chassis. And I don't know how many beyond, just a real handful are left on the open wheel front that would want to do such things. So it might be even easier for IndyCar to choose Dallara this time than it was presented as being a tough decision last time. Just don't think there's going to be as many names for them to consider. Let's go to our pal Jerry Sudduth, who says, after watching Alexander Rossi's performance in the Baja 1000, what other forms of racing would you want to see him do a one-off? Jerry says, I for one would love to see him in a Meyershank Acura NSX dicing it up at Daytona or Sebring in IMSA. I'd like to see that as well, Jerry. Keep in mind that Alexander's done the 24 Hours of Le Mans in an LMP2 car. He has done the Rolex 24 in the Delta Wing, so he's done a little bit of sports car stuff. I guess what comes to mind for me is maybe he should or could consider really following modern-day John Andretti footsteps, right? If we think about the great John Andretti and that period in time in the early 1990s, I believe it was, where he was doing NHRA drag racing. And there's NASCAR involved and IndyCar. He'd come out of a really successful sports car career. I'd say some of the fun, diverse stuff like that. I mean, the Baja 1000's amazing, but I'm just trying to think of what are the most extreme and uniquely different things that he could do. I don't know if he has an affinity for motorcycles. I know that he's a somewhat tall kid, so maybe his frame wouldn't be the perfect jockey size you would want for a superbike or MotoGP type thing, but I'd just say that we know how talented he is. It would be great to see him explore and express that in other formats, as you've mentioned. It's a great question, Jerry. I just think maybe the John Andretti plan would be pretty darn cool. Of get him into a cup race somewhere, maybe, Xfinity. I realize that Honda is not involved there, so that might be a bit of a challenge since he is definitely a company man. But yeah, look, between the contacts you could possibly bring up in IndyCar, Graham Rahal might know a family that's involved in the NHRA, could probably make some introductions. So if we're just talking fun and a bit of a, what can Alexander drive this week, which might be a pretty cool reality show of his own, we could get him into all kinds of fun stuff. I think we're also seeing his personality start to come out a bit, and so maybe as he's getting to be a little bit older and looking up and seeing the world a little bit more, maybe he'd embrace that. So I think this would be pretty darn cool. And also big props to our friends Mike Kitchell at his new Catalyst 317 PR agency that went down to Baja with Alexander to help create a lot of the content that we saw. And also big old sexy himself, Chris Cross, videographer and shooter, who brought a lot of awesome footage to us as well. So great job down there, guys. We have two more questions before we get to Cara here, and they're both from Reddit. Definitely my favorite screen name, Sage's Missing Shirt. Hey Marshall, do you think IndyCar needs to try harder to get into the esports marketplace, with other sanctioning bodies creating series like F1 Esports or the NASCAR Peak Antifreeze series? Do you think it's time IndyCar hops on board, or is what they're doing now with partners like iRacing, where you can race the Delar DW12 on 13 of the 16 tracks that are available, is that adequate? No, it's 100% not adequate. It is one of few things I would say that IndyCar is lagging behind the times on very heavily. If you think about, what was it, a couple years ago, working with IMS Productions, working, back on the TV side, they brought the modern-day visor cam into the entertainment space. And I realized that, 15, 20 years ago that there was, in kart/champ car, we had the little kind of lipstick, tiny camera inside the driver's helmet, which looked amazing. Quality wasn't that great, but just saying that there are areas where IndyCar has done some really unique things to bring new approaches, hopefully new eyeballs to the series. This is one, though, that I know that conversations are held. Spoke with CJ O'Donnell, the chief marketing officer at IndyCar, who's leaving here shortly, unfortunately, but I know that they've had meetings, continue to hold meetings about such things. I would just say that while there are many, many, many things that require IndyCar's full and immediate attention, we're talking oval safety and catch fences, we're talking about a new title sponsor, we're talking about a lot of things. This is one of those items that as each day goes by and there is not a true and proper esports link to the series, it's just losing ground and losing distance to other series, but also it's just another day where you're not giving a fairly engaged portion of the world that loves their esports a reason to know about IndyCar or care about IndyCar. So yeah, cannot argue in any way. Have mentioned this to the series. Others have mentioned it to the series. They know it's a thing. They know it's something they need to address. And I'm genuinely hopeful that whether it is CJ by the end of the year or whomever his replacement is getting into 2019, this is a story, this is a headline I hope we are reading very soon about a deal that's being done, and it not just being a deal, but something that really engages and makes it something important instead of, oh, all the other series have one, we need to have one too. I know that's not how they would approach it, but going above and beyond here seems like it's what IndyCar needs if it's going to gain some of the ground that it has lost. Last question here. Good old Sad and Shy, another wonderful screen name. Hey Marshall, what is your take on the most recent Danica interview? She really seems to know how to stir up the fan base, but not in a good way. This is in reference to the Graham Bensinger interview at what looked like her home, something like that, in a very relaxed, homey environment. Can't say that I am was surprised. I'd hope nobody was surprised, because that's kind of who Danica is, or has been, for a really long time. If you are looking for someone who is seeing the positives first and the negatives last, that hasn't been Danica, at least in a professional capacity. Can't tell you what she's like in her home life or otherwise. I don't know her socially, but at least in a athletic frame, you don't have to look that far. In interviews going way back, early days of IndyCar, throughout her IndyCar career, in NASCAR, if there's something to pick at, something to criticize, something to say that isn't very nice, that maybe borders on the dickish, no, that's been a pretty consistent drumbeat of hers. So I don't know if that makes her a bad person. I wouldn't say that that makes her more or less than other drivers. Men, I guess I can't think of many women, but honestly, AJ Foyt wasn't always a pleasure to interview unless you really knew him, or if you liked being berated. I mean, there are plenty of men who I would say are in that, negative, got something rude, nasty, or just unkind to say reaction or sentiment first and foremost. So, I don't know. I mean, if she was a current driver, I would say that her comments would maybe be more relevant. If she was a driver who, other than a really excellent year in 2009 where she finished 5th in the IndyCar Championship ahead of the rest of her Andretti teammates, she's good at Indy, obviously, a couple times, and she had a really strong 2009 season. Other than that, she's not someone who, just being really frank and clear, was ever accused of being one of IndyCar's best. Nor was she ever accused of being one of IndyCar's most committed. The one who was willing to stay all hours, come in early, stay late, do whatever is needed, bond with your crew chief, your mechanics, gearbox person, damper guy or gal, your race engineer. She put in work, I think, like many drivers did, at the same level that many drivers did. Her criticism that those who showed up early, or were, there was a competition to show up early, and that was fake, it was just for show. If she has seen that and knows that the folks showing up and doing that were truly just doing it for show, then okay, perfectly valid criticism. The thing about those abstaining from alcohol throughout the season. Again, there's an assertion that by those doing that it's all for show, to try and portray something false, and that in NASCAR, by comparison, folks show up, some drivers show up sometimes just a couple hours before practice and are crushing beers and other things, portraying an image of, on the Cup side, there's no need for all that excess, there's no need for putting on airs that you're coming in early and staying late. You can just come in right before practice, do your job, go home, and then go drink some beers, and all's good and all's great. If this was coming from an IndyCar champion, a NASCAR champion, I would probably say, okay, those are some words to listen to. I'm not saying they'd be right or wrong, but at least they'd be coming from a place of excellence. If we're honest with ourselves, I'd have to say that mindset, that locked-in athletic mindset of, I'm going to get in as early as I can to try and prepare more than my rivals, to speak with my engineers, talk about our game plan, review past data of what we did, look at weather conditions, and just try and fill my brain, become an encyclopedia for that day's work. And then also saying, you know what, I'm trying to win a championship. I'm sure I can have a beer or a glass of wine every night, but I don't want to. I want to. This season that I'm in, it's special. Every season is special, and the beer and the other, I got plenty of time to do that in the off season. But for now, I want to remain locked in the mindset of championship pursuit. It's nothing new. It's not unique to IndyCar or NASCAR. The ones who are competitive year after year, always up front and in the hunt. Formula One, sports cars. It's more a theme and a trend for elite athletes. You can extend that into other forms of the sport. Sure, I'm sure that there are some LeBron-type talents in basketball who do like to have a glass of wine with dinner, and there are others who say, nope, I am abstaining. Doesn't make one better than the other. They're all elite, but at least for what I've seen across many athletes in and out of racing, there tends to be a champion caliber mindset of work harder, get up earlier, work later, look for any and everything I can to differentiate myself from my rivals so I can become a champion, whether it is swinging a bat, using a racket, shooting a ball, throwing something, kicking something, turning a steering wheel. I think that's just the hallmark of a modern day champion's mindset. The fact that someone who was never a champion thinks that those aspiring to be one and doing things in a very strict, highly committed, regimented way in one series are fake, and those that she saw in another series who maybe weren't prescribing to that, after those elite drivers across all major series, you probably find that second tier. Have a beer, it's all good. Look, okay, great, you go ahead and come in at 7:30 because that's when your engineer gets in. I'll be in at 8:45 because we've got a 9 a.m. meeting. Okay, cool. I also know a lot of drivers who've done that throughout the years, and I would never confuse them with being all-time greats, and they certainly, to my knowledge, have not been champions in IndyCar. So, hey, it's her opinion. I don't know if it's super earned, but it's her opinion, obviously. As I mentioned, there are a lot of men who say less enlightened things or harsher things, and they're probably celebrated more for it. And I would hope Danica would not be criticized for this because of her gender. I would just say if there's any criticism that might go her way, it would be possibly due to somewhat light credentials in this area to compare and contrast what makes an IndyCar or a NASCAR driver successful, because she's been close a little bit in IndyCar, never really in NASCAR, and those tend not to be the insightful opinions that people are searching for from drivers who fall in that zone. So, I don't know. Tell me what you think. She was spot on if she was just playing to old stereotypes of wine and cheese and snootiness in IndyCar and good old boy fun in NASCAR. I mean, it sounds like something we've heard for decades, just without a couple of the more specific kernels, but who knows? I could be completely misreading this, and as always, look forward to your feedback on the variety of social media platforms that we use. All right, with that said, let's get going with our pal, Cara Adams, Firestone Chief Race Tire Engineer. Cara Adams, I cannot tell you how happy I am to have you here on the old Marshall Pruitt podcast to make our listeners, IndyCar fans, you keep me current, you keep a lot of us smart and plugged into what Firestone is doing in IndyCar. So thank you for taking some time here at the end of the day to field some questions and take part in the show.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Marshall. It's always a pleasure talking with you.
Well, I won't push back on that one too much, but that's...
I learn something new every time, too.
Good. I can keep elevating my idiocy. There's new levels. He has more. Let's kick off one, which is probably the most salient off-season question so far on tires, coming in from Matthew Ponto, who says, how are you able to determine the results of a test such as the IMS test last month, knowing that track conditions will likely be different during the race? And Matthew is referring to the recent IMS Speedway test, where ambient conditions were, by comparison to the baking oven of May, rather cool. So curious how what you learn in completely different conditions might help you and your team develop tires that'll work in possibly much hotter conditions next May.
So, Marshall, Matthew has a great question there. So we have to design tires that work around a multitude of ranges. But some of the track temperatures we actually saw at the second Indianapolis test. So we actually have been there twice, one towards the end of the season and one after the season. And we are developing tires to help with the racing next year. So we were able to test some right-side construction, some compounds on left and right sides, and come up with what we think the ideal conditions are. Now, we know that the temperatures were a little bit cooler than what we'll see in May. This past May was the second hottest ambient temperature on record, but we know and we can go back in the laboratory and design compounds that work through all of these different ranges. So, one of the things we have is that 50-50 rule. We know at Indianapolis, we may have very early in the month, we may be running at 50 degrees, but towards the end of the month, we could be up to 93 like we saw during the races past year.
Crazy. J.D. Ellis is up next, Cara, asking, what are the considerations that prevent giving teams alternate reds on ovals? I love this question, by the way.
It is a great question. So long ago, we actually did have option tires, And what we found is through the years, everybody started gravitating towards one tire. Maybe the option tire could have been a different stagger, so it would help you go through the turn a little bit better. But towards the end of when we had those options, everybody kind of gravitated towards one tire. So it's difficult to set up a race car to go around an oval. Think of something like Pocono. You're thinking about 3 very different turns. You throw in something like a different tire compound or a different stagger combination that you're asking the teams to run, it's really difficult. You got to get that car set up, got to get it great for one lap. Adding that extra tire variable in oval is just asking a lot out of the drivers.
Well, we're talking about compounds and options here, and we have a couple of folks weighing in with something similar. We'll go to one from our pal Carlos Villalobos, who says, would it be possible to have more than the 2 compounds if we're talking road and street courses of primary and alternates? Curious if you think there might come a time or a need to expand the compound range to 3 or more? And if that were to happen, Cara, do you think that would be an internal decision or something where teams and or the IndyCar series came to you and said, hey, this might be something we develop for the future?
Yeah, I think we work really well with Jay Fry and his team. Jay Fry, Bill Pappas, all of them do a phenomenal job, and we're communicating every week. If they were to come to us and say, hey, if we think we have 3 compounds that might make the racing better, it might be something that we would consider. But I think at this point, it's just a little bit complex to fit into a race weekend, especially right now. The rules say that you have to use one of each, primary and alternate. Having that 3rd compound is going to add a lot more variables into what the teams need to decide to do.
I also like what you mentioned just previously, coming back to the point of the oval, call it alternates. There tends to be a bit of gravitation in one direction. So if we have 2, you're probably going to have teams finding that a particular compound works best on that day in that race. 3, not saying that a 3rd would be bad, just you're still going to get some gravitation. Maybe teams then shift towards 2 of those 3 instead of one of the 2, but in essence there's probably going to be one compound that is used less on the day than the others, and I think that's just natural dynamics. So
yeah, you take something like Detroit, for example. This past year at Detroit, everybody wanted to use the alternate tire first, and then they wanted to use the primary tires the rest of the race. So adding an extra variable in there is not necessarily going to change the characteristic of the racing. I think people will probably gravitate towards the strategies that they were going to use anyway, but it adds just a little bit of complexity of how many wheels teams are going to need to have and how many compounds they're going to need to have available, how many steps they're going to have in the pit box. It just makes things a little bit complicated.
So I'm wondering if our pal Derek McCord, who's up next, is either an aspiring race engineer or maybe he has his own car that he drives and is wanting to learn a little bit more about tire temps and what you're looking for in optimal tire spread across the carcass. Derek asks, what temps do you look for on an oval versus a road course, inside, middle, and outside? Is it a 5-degree difference across each measurement? ?
Well, Derek, that's a great question. When we look at tire spread, it's a place like Indianapolis, you might have 30 degrees difference between the inside of the tire and the outside of the tire. So there's, depending on what kind of track you're on and what the characteristic is, you might get a lot more heat on the inside. And that's one thing that the team engineers look a lot at. They'll look at that temperature spread across and decide, do they need to add more camber? Do they need to take out more camber? Is there anything that they need to do with their toe settings to change how much they are able to use the tire? So there's a lot that goes into what camber settings that they decide to run. A lot of it is what track that they're at. So there's a lot that goes into it, but we try to give them tire test model. So before they even get to the track, we give them a lot of data. That data includes how the camber affects the tire performance. So they're looking at a lot of that data, and then they're looking at that temperature, and then the engineers from the team are deciding what they need to do to set up the car based on what our tire technicians that are working with every car will give them as far as a temperature receipt from their car.
The other thing too, Derek, is at that mythical road course or street course that doesn't exist, where there's not only an equal number of lefts and rights, but just all 4 tires are treated identically. in theory, you can look for spreads that are relatively similar front, rear, side to side, etc. But in reality, you're going to find that, of course, you don't want the spreads to be crazy, but at the same time, you're not too surprised if the left rear is doing the least amount of work. You might have an easier time achieving closer spreads, but to the one that might have more camber thrown at it, you're going to accept that the inside of that tire is probably going to be a little bit hotter than the outside, again, depending on roll and blah, blah, blah. But, as much as there are mental guidelines where you're trying to keep things in a similar spread universe, there's also times where if things aren't super, super close, it might not be due to a mistake in setup. It might not be toe being off or too much or too little inflation. Sometimes you do get something depending on what the track wants from the tire and what the driver needs from the car to go quickly. You might not always stick within that traditional lane, I guess, is the best thing I'm getting at here.
Yeah, that's a great answer.
Let's see. We're going to go to, and as I mentioned earlier before we started recording, Cara, the great names are always from Reddit. So thanks again to our Reddit group here. This comes in from Great Zapper, who asks a question for Cara, which might be quite basic, but I don't know. What are the principal differences between an oval tire and a road course, one if or at all? And the asker, because I don't know a gender, I will just say it, is curious. I'm guessing the oval tires are different due to the higher loads on the right sides, ? So maybe just going back to the very basic principles as asked here, Cara, what's the difference between an oval tire that your team makes and a road course tire, and what are the differences in forces that both would have to deal with?
Well, Great Zapper has a great question. Yes, the oval tires are different because they're higher loads on the right side. If you think about the car that's always turning left, all that load gets transferred to the outside. So that outside tire has to be stiffer. It has to be more durable. So you can add grip back on the left side. Now, a road course, obviously, you want to be able to turn in both directions. The tires themselves, the physical sizes, are relatively similar. You'll have stagger on an oval because you want to be able to help turn always in that same direction. But for the most part, oval tires are very different from the left side to the right side, where road course tires are relatively similar left to right side. And exception might be a place like Mid-Ohio or Portland, where the turns are predominantly in one direction, where you can kind of give up performance on the left side turns because you're focusing on the right sides. So in a place like that, you might have a different compound from the inside of the course to the outside of the course. But in general, the tires are a lot more similar on a road course than they are on an oval.
You answer these questions on a frequent basis, and I know that whether it's speaking to kids at a school, young men or young women involved in STEM, and so on, I appreciate the fact that I'm going to have to think of some real stumpers for you there, Cara, because it feels, well, you also prepare. I mean, you're also a well-studied person, but yeah, I'm going to have to think of some that are truly out of left field here to get you.
A little bit.
All right, if we're in space and zero gravity is affecting my torque let's go to Connor Kennard, who asks, how much data do teams get from the tire manufacturer going into a weekend, and has this changed during eras when there were multiple tire manufacturers compared to nowadays with a single supplier? And Connor also asks, how is the data that teams got over the years, how has that changed? So I know it's asking you to be a little bit of a historian, and I can provide some from back in the day, but just curious, maybe starting with what's being fed to teams going into a race weekend. I assume that's more than just a one-page fax from your office.
So that's a great question. Our engineers do so much work before we even get to the racetrack. So 95% of our work is done before we even get on the plane to go to St. Petersburg. So we have both spring rate document, which basically how the tire performs under load, some very easy static calculations, size calculations. Basically, it's some information about the tire. But then beyond that, we get what we call force and moment data. So I like to call this the tire black box in the simulation. So we're able to work with the engine manufacturers and the teams to provide a model for the team. So before they even get to St. Pete and turn a wheel for the very first time, they can get an idea of what their car, the changes that they want to make, and the tires all perform together. So we work with the teams to get that and any other kind of information that they need to help set up their car. And whether it's changed or not, since we've been in competition, from what I understand, because I actually saw this question on Twitter beforehand, and I talked to Dale Harrigal because he actually still happened to be in the office today. And some of the data is pretty much similar as to what we were providing in competition. Those tire models are a bit more robust than what we were able to provide back in the day, so there's a little bit more dynamic effects and some things that we're able to help the teams with now that we didn't have the technology to do beforehand.
Let's go to Aaron Mallard next. Aaron sent in a bunch of questions. I can tell that he was really happy to have someone to help educate the world on tires. Aaron says, I have a similar question. How do you look at camber settings and how they would differ, say, on a track like Texas Motor Speedway compared to the Indy 500? So just thinking about the dynamic camber at play between Indy, which does have some banking in the corners, but is not a super high banking track, compared to Texas, where in the corners you might have a hard time running up some of those corners because they're so steep. Curious how camber, from your perspective with what you see working with teams, how that influences tire performance at both tracks.
Yeah, absolutely. So great points, Marshall, on dynamic camber, because you could look at just the static camber number, and that's not telling you the whole story. Depending on the track setup, what the roll you have in the car, what the car geometry is, it can be different on those tracks. So obviously when we're looking at maximizing the performance out of the tire, it's trying to maximize how much side force that you can actually get out of the tire. So there's a bit in the geometry of the tire, but our tires between Texas and Indianapolis are not necessarily the same. So the size might not be the same and the shape might not be exactly the same. So we give those tire models that we were talking about before, they're able to look at those, and that helps them to figure out exactly where the camber range. They're not as different as you would think between Texas and Indy now.
So those tire models, are we talking Legos, Build-A-Blocks? What exactly?
I like it. No, zeros and ones, Marshall. Zeros and ones.
The old, the numeric. Okay, we're talking like computers and stuff.
Computer
you have gotten
models,
high-tech, Cara. Good Lord.
Well, it's amazing. You know, it's a good point. We are designing tires much more virtually now than we have in the past. So we're still doing lots of experimental tire builds and construction builds and those sorts of things, but we can actually, before we even go to build our first physical tire model, we can model what it actually looks like on the computer. We can change things like endings and angles and shapes and see what the effect on the footprint of the tire, the spring rate of the tire, actually even the force and moment of the side force characteristics of the tire. So there's a lot before we even make that physical tire that we can learn on the computer.
So we know that Dallara, for example, has a high-quality driver-in-the-loop simulator. Chevy and Honda both make use of such things to really try and shape their on-track performance parts and pieces setups before the cars ever hit the track. Is that something that Firestone is in the practice of doing, using some sort of DIL virtual tire development before you would actually construct and go to the track to test those things? Or do you currently just rely on coming up with what you all feel is the best and then doing practical testing?
So, yes, it is a little bit more putting the tire into a model, into a physical test. So we would actually take some of the data that we would get from Dallara and Honda and Chevy and the teams. We're really fortunate in that when the cars are done on track, if we have a question about something that happened on a car, we can contact the engineer for the car, and they're just going to send us this whole pie data set. So it's a whole data set of what the car went through, what the loads on the tire were, what the braking was, what the throttle position was. And we can use all of that and all of the vehicle dynamics from the car to figure out what exactly is going on with the tire. So we can take those conditions that we get from the car, and we can design the tire around those conditions. So there's a lot of really unique things that we can do even before we get to the racetrack or before we build a tire.
Let's go to one that this is going to educate me as well. Coming in from our pal Joseph Hall. who says, why is a combination of track plus air temperature equaling 100 degrees the magic number for oval races? He says, I find it remarkable that a tire can perform at on a track that's either 50 degrees or 110 degrees. Curious if you can share some insights on that.
So I find it remarkable, too. I'm always impressed by the work that our chemical engineers, our compounders can do to make this compound that works well at the very beginning of the month of May when we're all freezing and wearing coats and blankets. Well, maybe I'm the only one that's wearing a blanket. But,
I'm probably in shorts, by the way. So just,
or you were probably in shorts.
I also have
sweatpants.
I wear nature's insulation, though, so yes.
That works, too. So we need to be able to make a tire that works with those conditions and then also works when it's ridiculously hot, like we had 93 degrees this year. So that magic number of track and air temperature, we did have a strict 50-50, again, 50 degrees ambient, 50 degrees track temperature. But we've got a little bit of flexibility in that. We want to make sure that gets to be 100 degrees. Too much below 50, you have sliding, you can not have enough grip. So we need to make sure we design our compounds in a range that we know is going to be the best for the cars. So if we decided we wanted to design race tires that went down to freezing point and even lower, they're not going to perform so well at the really hot temperatures too. So you have a design window that you work around. And like I said, our compounders and chemical engineers, they come up with some amazing tread compounds that can work in those ranges.
And Joseph, I love the 100-degree angle as well. It would be strange, Cara, if we did get to the track and had something like 20 degrees track temp, 80 ambient. I mean, that might be a sign of the apocalypse or something. We'd have the 100. It just wouldn't quite work. Or vice versa, 80 degrees track and 20 ambient. There'd be some weird stuff.
Let me tell you, I've been at a track where it's been 49 and 51, and I had Mario Andretti yelling at me about why we can't run the two-seater. So there's got to be a little bit of flexibility. When Mario wants to run the two-seater, Mario's got to be able to run the two-seater.
Well, I do I guess a little bit silly recollection as well. I think it was 95, late 95, so it would have been winter of 95. The Genoa Racing team that I worked for, we were testing at Portland, using Firestones with our driver Mark Hotchkiss, who was already a fairly light and 0% body fat kind of guy. And we were all, I can't tell you what the temperature was, I don't remember, but we all had on every piece of insulating something. We looked like little kids bundled up with 5 jackets. We could barely move, it was so cold. And yet, instead of being smart and saying, let's just scrub this and go home, we insisted on testing. And I recall just packing the car with blankets and such from Mark, trying to get a heater blowing in there. Just, granted, we might have been snowflakes ourselves, but it was just miserable. Yet we were determined that, hey, if it's ever really cold, this was before the minimum condition requirement to go out on track, and this is a road course, obviously, but we just decided, well, hey, if it's ever freezing when we race, at least we can say we have really good data.
But you need to get that data. You need to know what you could be able to do. That's funny.
We were miserable. Mark didn't like us that much, and I think it was only his first or second test for us. Let's go to James Winnie Jr., who says, Cara, can you please discuss how you use tire pressure and temperature readings across the tire to evaluate how chassis setup is affecting tire performance? I like the angle of that question because it's so often, can you tell us how just straight up tires might be influencing or negatively influencing the chassis, but sometimes you got to realize that the tires don't work in isolation. It's how a lot of settings to the thing they're connected with could actually limit or improve their performance. And he also asks, how much do you look at the physical appearance of the tire wear to gauge information?
So James has a fantastic question there. I really like how it's worded and all. There's a lot that you can use based on what those temperature readings are or what the pressure is to look at your chassis setup. Sometimes we can see there's a lot more work going into the right front. You can go back and see, there was a lot of crossweight used in this particular outing. So there's a lot of things that you can see that. And sometimes you can see some interesting things. We had 2 years ago at Phoenix, we had a team that was wearing out the outside of the left front tire, which didn't make much sense at all. So we were looking at a few things, and I'm not going to tell you what the team name was or what the engineer was, but we kept asking them questions about what was going on with their car. It didn't look right. And one of my engineers and I looked at it and said, what camber are you running on your left front? Something doesn't look right. And the engineer looks down at his sheet of paper and he says, I'm running X amount of camber on my left front. I said, are you sure that that's right? It looks like it's a lot less, or maybe it's even in the wrong direction. Nope, my setup sheet says this, it's this. Period, end of discussion. All right, so next outing they go out, and same thing with the issue of the wear. Something's not right with this, and I go behind the tire, and I'm convinced that it's pointing the wrong direction. So for those of you not familiar with oval setups, you always have the camber that's pointing in the direction the car is turning. The tire looked like it was tilted the opposite direction to me, so I went back and I talked to the engineer and said, hey, I really think something's not quite right. What is it? He said it's negative something. I said, are you sure it's not positive? He ended up going back and looking at it, and I asked him to come behind the tire and look at the car and look at the tire with me. He looked at it, and he said, oh, okay. So we went back, and he actually realized that there was a wrong part on the car. They were able to fix it and get out before the race with fixing the issue with their car. So great question, long-winded answer, but yeah, there's a lot that you can tell by looking at the physical wear of the tire and also looking at the numbers that you see that come off of the pyrometer readings from the car.
I'll also just throw in, James, to add to this, and it varies certainly based on the level, the series that you're working in. If you're working in IndyCar as a race engineer and you have a highly skilled driver, the information coming off of the tires might not lead you in a direction in chassis changes on their own, because you'll probably wait to hear from that highly skilled driver to provide their feedback, which would then heavily influence any changes you might make. In some of the training series or some of the lesser series, even drivers who maybe aren't that great at any level, I can just share from experience that as a race engineer, the first thing that you want is your tire information, because it is beyond the 1,000 channels of data coming off the car. It does give you, at least for me, the best picture into what is happening on the racetrack with the vehicle, either from the setup that has been applied or how the car is driving, based on how the driver is providing inputs. And you can come away pretty quickly with, you get your tire information once the cars come to a stop, your pressures and temperatures. And again, there are many, many times where I've said, okay, so do I tell him that he has an understeer problem, or do I ask him, so how is the understeer, to open the dialogue, because the sheer numbers sitting in front of you are telling you, that on the right front tire tells me, I know what's happening based on the numbers I've been given. That's what the tires are telling us. Do I need to use that as a strict and straight direction and tell the driver these are the changes I'm going to make? Do you use that as a method to coax the information out? And again, I'm not talking about the elite drivers. The elite drivers will come in and say, half pound less of this, 2 turns of that, up here, down there, boom, off they go, and you're noticeably faster. But for the rest, the mortals, or those who are training, again, tires you can turn off a data system if you maybe have the experience of engineering a race car pre-data coming online as a common tool, and still be able to do the majority of your work based on that information, looking at the tires. Also, for those who watch intently during practice of an IndyCar session, when the car comes in and goes up on the stands, you'll notice either the chief mechanic or someone similar will grab a mirror, usually on some sort of little extension, to look beneath the car to look at the wear on the floor, the paint that's been painted, to get a feel for ride height there. Just interesting. And I have a friend, a sports car engineer, Le Mans winning engineer there, who's told me about, in somewhat recent years, Cara, where they had some fundamental data issues. They could not trust the information coming off of the car, and because of his age and experience in working with tires and old school pre-data, he was one of the few people who could actually lead them towards high quality engineering directions. because it was him digging his thumb into the tire carcass, looking at them, just reading the sheer numbers of pressures and temperatures, getting a feel for ride height, and having to kind of go the old school route. But really, that tire information, it's so vital, and it's one of the things that I loved when I was an engineer.
Yeah, as an engineer, I can tell you the better engineers in the series can look up from data. And not that we all don't make mistakes and look at what we have right in front of us, the numbers we have right in front of us, but like you said, Marshall, being able to actually physically look at the car, look at the tires, see what the car or the tires or whatever it is trying to tell you, and make decisions based on that.
Let's see, we've got a few more here, kind of general tire questions, and we've broken them out into a couple of more dedicated categories here. And thank you again, Cara, for taking some time. This is just a blast.
Oh, I would love it. Thanks.
All right, so this one definitely falls in the category of fun. And this one comes in from Anthony Pienta, who says, Cara, I noticed your Twitter picture is from the Indy Mini Marathon. And since you're adept at evaluating drivers' performance under a variety of circumstances, I wonder how you think drivers might fare over a 13.1-mile foot race. Who would go out strong but fade? Who would have the best kick? And who would claim a pulled quad before the gun even goes off? Oh.
That's a fantastic question. Oh my goodness, sorry, that makes me laugh.
So we don't want to get you too many grumpy drivers mad at you here, but I mean, like I'm one to talk. I'd engage in a 13.1 foot race. Certainly not 13.1 miles, but you have to know some of the drivers who probably enjoy running, enjoy some of the triathlon type stuff. There are any that stand out as like, all right, this is my ally, and a few others who are like, all right, I'll see you at the bar afterwards. So that's probably.
Well, I know. There's no way I could ever keep up with somebody like Scott Dixon or some of the other people that are just really, really fantastic runners. The very first Ironman 70.3 I did, Tony Kanaan was competing in the same race. I think it was a little bit slower than his running pace, and he was way, way faster than my biking pace. So there's a lot of great drivers that are so physically fit. Going out to another series, I actually competed in an Ironman 70.3 with my friend Catherine Lake, who did amazing, also quicker than me in the run. So I just hang out there. I love running. I think the Twitter profile picture is back from 2007, 2008. It's quite an old picture, but I love that Indianapolis Mini Marathon for the people in the Indianapolis area, people that like to run. So much entertainment, music every mile. You kind of get a little bit distracted that you're running. You know you're running, but it's a little bit of a good distraction. So
I love the fact too that you leave the speed up to the drivers when it comes to running, but you're definitely plugged into the endurance side. That kind of fits your tire world there, Cara.
It does.
Let's see. By the way, and I'm sure you've spoken with him about this, but Racer.com's editor Mark Lendenning, completely insane doing hyper marathons, like 50-mile plus. I don't know how. I mean, my knees would explode.
More power to him. I've done 2 full marathons, and I've said the only reason I would ever do another full marathon is if it was part of a full Ironman. I don't think the human body is meant for 26 miles, so 13 miles is just a great challenge. I like that number. I think I'll stick with it.
All right, we've got another great question here coming in from Eric Schmeider, I believe, and if I just murdered your last name, Eric, please send me a note how to pronounce it correctly. Eric says, Cara, what is the most stressful part of the race weekend from your position? And what is the most trying situation you can recall, whether it's tire performance, safety, or otherwise? And what levers are available or were available to react? So interesting, kind of not the numbers and technical side, but just the management and having to oversee all that you do, because that is a big part of what you do. It's not just buried away in skunk work labs. It's actual managing of this fairly impressive operation as well, along with a lot of other great members of your team.
Yeah, I think for the group of us, IndyCar drivers, they're like members of our family. We are always doing everything we can do to make sure they have the best possible tires on the track. anytime the cars are on track, for anybody, whether it's a mechanic or an engineer, it's always a bit stressful. One of the things that I do at the beginning of the Indianapolis 500, where, those 33 drivers are out there, I'm looking at my watch, and I have a heart rate monitor on my watch, and my heart rate is always above 120, and I have a pretty low resting heart rate. It can be 120 beats per minute just sitting there. So we realize that the trust that the drivers have in our tires, and it's not something that we take lightly. So it's something that whether we're at the office or at the racetrack, we do whatever we can do to make sure that the drivers can count on the performance of our tires.
Wow. Well, we're going to need to keep you super calm. So let's see, where should we go next? All right, Daniel Kincaid, this is a strong candidate for my favorite question of the week already. How much of the variation between Firestone reds and blacks, that being the alternates and primaries, is a guess versus hard data and science?
So that's a great question. So I'm going to say this is going to depend on whether you're talking to my chemical engineers and compounders, or you're going to talk to me, or maybe some of the people from the teams. So there is a lot of work, a lot of science in graphs and testing that goes into deciding the difference between the alternate tire and the primary tire. So the Firestone primary tire being the one that stays pretty consistent over the life of the stint, and the alternate tire the one that's meant to be faster for qualifying or faster for half the stint and then goes off during the rest of the race. It's not just as simple as putting together some stuff into a formulation, seeing what comes out, seeing whether one has a higher durometer or hardness than the other. There's a lot of different metrics that our compounders test to figure out where exactly it's going to be. Now, we can get that exact difference, and it can be, let's just say, 0.8 of a second for a particular track on a particular race weekend. But if you change the car setup or you change a driving style, that difference might be different. If you're on a 70-degree day versus a 90-degree day, that drop-off might be different. So there's a lot of science behind it, but actually once you get to the track, there are a lot of variables: temperature, driving style, car setup, so many other things that can actually make the difference of those tires a little bit more. We have similar tires that we take to a few different street courses, and the gap might be different depending on whether you're running on more asphalt or more concrete. So there's a lot of different variables that go into there, so there's a lot of science. But sometimes we're actually using our best judgment based on what we think the race weekend is going to be to bring that right alternate primary tire combination.
If only we could apply numbers to gut feelings. Then we could say it was 100% science. Let's see. Next question is from our friend Andrew C., who always sends in great questions. A little bit of a longer one here. Andrew asks, Cara, in general terms, what's your process of designing tires for a new track IndyCar's visiting, like Circuit of the Americas, or maybe a, quote, new old track that Firestone has some experience at, like WeatherTech Raceway Laguna Seca? And does any of that past experience from the kart or Champ Car era help when designing tires for, say, the return to Monterey? And then he also asks, for a track like COTA, is there anything that you can draw from other similar circuits, or is a road course tire a road course tire? So a couple questions in there.
So that's actually a really great question, and that's one of the things that we're doing when we're looking at new tracks. For example, Portland, when we were looking at that last year, we found that it was really similar to Mid-Ohio in a lot of different ways, which is why we brought what we brought. We were able to look at some vehicle data from many years past, and the same thing with Laguna Seca, getting some data beforehand and then being able to actually go there and physically test if we can. So Circuit of the Americas, we were actually there a few weeks ago, and we were testing tires with a wide range of compounds. We were able to take a track surface scan. So we have this blue laser that we take and we run across the surface, and it gets us an idea of micro and macro texture, so basically how rough the pavement is. We're able to take that measurement of roughness and we're able to compare it to a few different tracks. So based on our analysis, we found a lot of similarities between that and between Indianapolis Grand Prix circuit. So we're able to do those analysis and then look at what the loads that the car will see, some of the speeds that the car will see, and then figure out what we need to bring as far as combinations of primary and alternate tires. So we're actually able to go there and test. So we were able to test the primary. We know that Circuit of the Americas is one of the first races we need to build for, since the open test is happening all the way in February. And then we have the race coming soon afterwards. So there's a lot of data that we can take physical data measurements of the track. We've even gotten either track surface impressions, where we take a material, press it into the track, and then scan the negatives of that. Or we've actually gotten actual physical core samples to analyze as part of our decision on what tire to bring in a road course.
I believe we discussed this in one of the 2 podcasts we've recorded that have yet to reach the world, so I apologize there. But I believe one of the things we discussed, which might be interesting to share here as well, Cara, is, and you alluded to speaking with Dale Harrigal, your predecessor in this role, on top of the actual compiled numerical data that you might have, and a lot of archives that I'm sure you can go back to, of, when we were at Monterey, for example, back in the day. Firestone also has a pretty cool legacy, I would say, membership, in that whether it's Dale being in this role previously, our dear beloved Paige Mater, who is enjoying life outside of this, but I know is always there for a phone call from, hey, what did you do 20 years ago here or there? There's also a pretty cool, just, I guess, small union of Firestone race tire engineers who love helping when necessary with any, previous information, even just anecdotal.
Yeah, so we have the great Dale and Paige and some of their feedback, but our compounder has also been in race tire engineering. Brett Schilling has been in race tire engineering for over 20 years. So he's got some of that long-term memory. And what also helps is being able to talk to some of the IndyCar drivers that drove on our tires back when we were in Laguna Seca, or even back in Portland. Tell me what you remember about these tracks. One of the things I'm really impressed about with our IndyCar drivers is their ability to remember specific corners of specific years. Not everybody can do that, but it's a pretty phenomenal thing for them to remember, and then we can go back, look at what that data actually said, and then look and see what we have as far as our tire compound selections that we could bring.
All right, let's get to our last general tire question here. This comes in from, again, another pal, Don Gowron. It says, Cara, for the tires used on super speedways, for the 2 different 500 milers, are the compounds the same on all 4 corners, or do they vary? And he says, I understand that the outside tires may be different because of the loads, but he read somewhere that the compounds could be different all the way around. So, curious if we're looking at, say, a Pocono versus an Indy, do you use the same goodies at both? And then also curious about compound individuality on each corner at those tracks.
All right, well, Don's a great guy, and it's a good question. So in all of our oval tires, we have a more durable right side than we do the more durable compound right side than we do on our inside. So again, the inside gives you back a little bit of grip, and then the outside has that durability to get you through those loaded corners. All of our tracks have the same compound on both right sides and the same compound on both left sides. We don't mix all 4 corners or anything like that. And there is some carryover between tracks. So looking at some of our ovals, when we raced at both we raced at both Phoenix and Gateway, we used the same tire compounds and constructions at both of those tracks, with both of the short ovals. But Iowa, we might use the same right sides that we do at Texas. So there's some carryover there. Pocono, we would use the same basic tire from Texas. So there's a lot of similarity in what we can bring, but it's all dependent on the specific track that we go to.
Let's move into a couple of sections that we've broken out that are, we had a few different folks asking the same question or similar ways of asking these questions, so I figured we might just break them out into their own little buckets. And let's start with road relevance. And so we'll go with the one from Craig Johnson on this that I think encompasses a lot of what folks are curious about. Craig asks, with the other series, when they talk about road relevance, what information does or can Firestone take from its race tires and apply to its road tires from its series in IndyCar? And he asks, is it things like compounds, wear patterns, tread patterns, etc.? So curious how Firestone uses its IndyCar involvement for more than just a marketing angle, but actually making our road tires better.
So there's a lot of cross-training that goes back and forth between our passenger tire world and our race tire world. So as far as the people that are working in the IndyCar series during the year will actually have projects where they're working on agricultural tires or passenger tires during the year, and they're able to bring back some of that technology from racing into some of our passenger tire world and vice versa. Now, as far as our tread compounds, you wouldn't want to use our street course tread compound on any of our road tires. It's going to wear away too quickly.
It'd be
the rolling
fun.
resistance isn't going to... It would be fun for maybe a few miles, but I don't know, Marshall. Do you want to go back to the tire store in 500 miles and say, all right, I need a new set?
Well,
I can't afford it.
You know, I agree. I'm just saying that would be some pretty fun on-ramp and off-ramp time. Granted, I might be going back to the dealership within about an hour with my driving habits, but yeah, point well taken.
Well, but there's a lot of tools that transfer back and forth between racing. Here's an example. One of the things that we talk about are virtual tire modeling. So understanding how our tires work virtually. There's a lot of transfer in between what we need out of a race tire and then pushing that technology for passenger tires. So there's a lot that goes into how we even develop some of the fundamental building blocks of how we develop a tire. Now, there is some transfer. One of the really neat things that we were able to do into this year is introduce a new rain tire. The new rain tire actually had a new tire modeling, tread modeling effort that we put together for racing, and that's going to make its way into the passenger tire world soon. So there's some transfer there as far as tread patterns and tread shapes. There's a lot of the things that are racing are very racing specific.
I'm going to move to our next category. And again, this is just consolidating a lot of great questions into one person's voice, since we've had a few people touch on this topic, and that is on intermediate tires. So a few folks who are curious, and we'll go with Jordan Darwin's question. It says, Cara, I've heard IndyCar wet weather tires are more of a intermediate rain tire. Is that a fair assessment? And also, how much of the development time and effort is devoted to IndyCar's rain tires versus slicks?
So that's a great question. So for IndyCar, we have one rain tire. Having multiple rain tires, again, adds a little bit more complexity. It's more teams need to carry for race weekends if they were needed to carry an intermediate and a full wet rain. As far as tread gauge, what we have is a full wet tire. We've tried to experiment with some lighter F1 style, light gauge intermediate rain tires, and really visibility seems to be an issue if it's too wet, and then if it's too dry, you don't want to end up with a tire that's too hard. So we do have to make sure we have a tire that works from a track to St. Pete all the way to something like a Watkins Glen or a Road America. So the same compound has to be able to get all of those different conditions, from a road course with some heavy loads and some turn speeds to something like Long Beach where we have the keyhole. So we have one tire for all of the different rain configurations.
I'm going to go to the next question, which comes in from Dirk Houghton, and this is another one where we've had a few different people ask in a variety of ways, and that is on the possibility of returning to having multiple tire suppliers. And I can speak at least to my era when I last worked in the series, and we had both Firestone and Goodyear involved. And Dirk says, I'm curious to know if you feel the current IndyCar series would benefit from having two or more tire suppliers in regard to competition, or would it hurt competition if one tire manufacturer is superior to the others? Keep up the great work. I'll take this one to start, Cara, if that's okay.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
Dirk, I'd say you're on to a couple points here. I know that when we had a very strong Goodyear and Firestone battle going, things tipped in Firestone's favor very quickly. It became the tire to have 1996 in kart in particular, is where Jimmy Vasser, when he won the championship using that Renard Honda Firestone combination, going into 97, boy, if you were not using Firestones, you were leaving time on the track. And it was only a couple of years later where that became the case in the Indy Racing League as well. I'd say if we're just looking at today and into the future a little bit, and this is not, I've always been a fan, and I've always loved Firestones. It actually goes way back to the old American Cities Racing League Sports 2000 days, when Firestone was the supplier there, and that's where I first got to know Page in like 1989 or 8 or something. That tells folks I'm really old, but I've always loved the company, just having worked directly with them as a mechanic or engineer or whatever. But I'll just say this, even though I have a long-term affinity for Firestone, would I love to see high-quality competition in IndyCar? Of course. But that's also where we start to struggle a little bit. If it was purely a road racing series, I would say that there would be more tire companies that could come in and provide similar, possibly equal, possibly exceeding, I don't know, but very high-quality tires to go up against Firestone. Where we have a fairly limiting factor, purely my opinion again, is the fact that we are on ovals, in a diverse array of ovals. And when you go and speak with IndyCar drivers who maybe use different brands of rubber in sports cars or whatever else they might do, they'll all come back and say, hey, working with this other brand, they're great, they're fantastic. I want the brand that is going to make sure that I am safe and competitive on ovals, and the one brand that has endured and proven that this can be done every year is Firestone. And I think that's going to end up being the reality that keeps this a single tire supplier series for a good while, if not for a really long time. Because being able to do what Cara and her team does and her predecessors have done for so many years, getting to a point to where their oval tires are lights out. You don't think about them. There's no concern about failure. That's kind of a magical place that I don't think the series wants to mess with. And if I started Pruitt racing tires tomorrow, I would know that I would need to spend myself into oblivion to just scratch the surface of that same comfort and assuredness on ovals that drivers currently have. So while I like the idea of multiple tires, brands and competition in the series, Dirk, I think we have a practical limitation here of, well, frankly, it's the same thing like up against Michelin in sports cars. There are other tire manufacturers that have tried to take them on at Le Mans, for example. Michelin has poured so many dollars into their sports car endurance racing product that by and large, they can't be beaten, or they have not been beaten, and the competition knows they're going to have to ask for reasonable sums from their board of directors to try and take them on. So it's all a bit of it might sound like a weird way to offer a compliment, but I think that's the place where Firestone rests in IndyCar, which is probably going to keep other tire manufacturers saying, well, maybe we need to look at NASCAR, or who knows what else, because this is a little bit of a different nut to crack. So I don't know if that resonates at all, Cara, and I know you're not here as a spokesman for the brand on whether you want competition, but I do think you guys have definitely built a pretty strong army of supporters for what you currently do, though.
Well, thank you very much, Marshall. I know myself and my team of engineers and compounders and technicians and everybody works with Firestone brand is really proud of our tires. Our engineers work so hard, work tirelessly, and we're very proud of the history of Firestone going back to 1911, even the more recent history, all of the people that had worked so hard to get us into racing in the first place. It's just a fantastic team to work with, and I'm really lucky and proud to be a part of it.
I'm going to get to the last couple of questions here and then let you on to your evening. I'm going to switch over to a new topic of career, and this is general things, either your career or others, other related items, and we'll go back to Aaron Malarick, again, I think our most frequent question provider this week, who asks, what responsibilities do industrial engineers have at a Firestone manufacturing facility?
All right, Aaron, great questions. So I am a mechanical engineer by background. There's a lot of mechanical engineers on my team, also chemical engineers, but in the plant, that's where you start to see more industrial engineers. And they do so many different things, from scheduling to looking at how to make the best machine to looking at processes. So it's really important. That industrial engineering degree is really important. They can play a huge role both at a tire facility and many other types of plants. We rely on them a lot in what we do.
Let's see. Let's go to Brian Cohn. Brian always sends in great questions for us. And this also refers back to the Cara Adams My Life and Racing Career podcast we recorded at Texas. in June that's sitting on my hard drive, and I promise I'm going to get that out here shortly over the holidays. You did answer this somewhat there, but it's strictly on me for not having that out. So let's use a question that you'll end up answering here, and I guess you already answered in the past. Brian says, what sparked your interest in engineering? Then what led you to become a tire engineer?
Well, I will give you the Cliff Notes version because Marshall and I had just such a great conversation. You guys will have to check out that podcast. But my interest in engineering started early. My mom was a science teacher, and she had neighborhood science camps. And I always thought that was really cool growing up. We did anything from make toilet paper rockets to she would go to the local butchers, and she would get pieces and parts from a cow so we could dissect and understand about how muscles or eyes or anything like that worked. So science was always cool. My grandfather was actually an engineer for NASA. So if that movie First Man came out, and I was able to see it with my mom, so that's my mom's father that was the engineer for NASA, and it was just really amazing to see some of the pieces that he worked on the space shuttle. He was actually on the launch team through the Apollo and through the space shuttle mission. So he worked on things like the sound suppression system, the TSM, and then the swing door, the very top swing arm where the astronauts loaded on. So he was kind of an engineer on all of those. So I always thought engineering was cool. When I went to school, I thought, maybe I want to be an astronaut or an engineer for NASA. I always thought about the engineering aspect. But then when I went to the University of Akron, where I got my Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering degree, I walked down to the machine shop one day. They were designing and building a Formula SAE car, so a mini version of an IndyCar, a little Honda CBR 600 motorcycle engine, and I started by sweeping the shop floors. Like many of us in racing, we had to start somewhere. So sweeping up the shop floors, have a couple fun stories I shared with Marshall about that. Realized racing was really cool, decided to get my own car because I thought it would be fast, but I realized it wasn't, so I had to make my own car fast. And then I realized, hey, can I do this for a living? Can I make a living doing racing? This is something that I love to do. I love to talk to kids about this because if it's something that I wanted to do and I found a way to do it, whatever your interest is, whether it's racing, whether it's airplanes like my little sister, she's a Boeing engineer, just be persistent and find a way to go out and do those things.
Of the many things I appreciate about you, Cara, I love the fact that with this beautiful, shiny piece of paper that says you have reached this level of academic excellence, the next question was, that's a beautiful degree. Did you learn how to use a broom? And you said, great, let me at it. I'm just saying, instead of like, see, I'm very smart and I should only have jobs where my hands are perfectly clean. No, between that, building your own engines and such at home, personal projects, just appreciate the fact that we can apply whatever stereotype that one might have for a chief tire engineer and such, but the reality is you've always been a racer.
Yes,
a great education on top of that, but you've always been a hardcore racer, which I think has only served you as you've really accelerated through this career path. Let's go to the last career question, and this comes in from our friends, the Anderson family, Vince and Wendy. He says, what efforts are you and Firestone doing to get more young ladies interested in STEM, that being really, I know, an area that is hugely important to you?
Oh, I love this question, and I love the fact that it comes from Vince and Wendy because I've talked to their kids at the racetrack before. So I have an absolute passion for getting kids interested in science and engineering. I love the idea that when I was younger, I had my mom as a role model, and I always thought that, okay, science is for women because my mom is the science teacher and my dad is the language teacher, so, the guys do the language thing and then women do the science thing. But I was lucky enough to have that role model, and I know there's a lot of other people that don't have role models, and we need good engineers. We need people that are interested in racing that are engineers. We need people in all sorts of engineering. So one of the things that I love about my job is the ability to talk about that. And, man, racing is cool. So going into a group of kids saying that you were able to work on race cars and be an engineer, that's one of those things that makes an impression. And they might not know anybody who are engineers, and so that might open up an idea for them. They might come to the racetrack with their parents, and they might see engineers for the first time. Or they might be in a school in the inner city Akron, and they might not have anybody or any friends that are engineers, and they might be able to hear my story or hear the story of some of my engineers that I'll actually go in and talk to the classes too, and that might consider engineering as a career where they might not have thought about that as an option.
I'll just mention this because maybe you have thought about this, maybe you haven't. I don't know where you will be in, say, 20 years, Cara, if you'll still be in a similar role or if you'll be running the entire company or, what you will be doing. But have you thought about what an IndyCar or IMSA or NASCAR, whatever it is, pit lane might look like in 20 years? I believe it's going to be, I don't want to say cooler, because that would imply it's not cool now, but I think it's going to be a lot more interesting knowing that folks that look like me, men, male-dominated sport, mostly white men, and again, we're not trying to turn this into a discussion of race and what, just saying, if you walk down an IndyCar pit lane or some of the areas where we would go, it has a very familiar look from series to series. Have you thought about what it might look like in 20 years, thanks to the work that you, Katie Hargett and her new initiative, and many others, whether it's women, men or women of color, etc. I gotta believe the work you all are investing now is going to have future pit lanes looking very, very diverse in the best kind of way.
So I love this question, and thank you for the question, Marshall. It's one of the things that I've been able to see from when I started. I was the only female traveling that worked on pit lane, the only female engineer that traveled on pit lane. But now, last year and the year before, we had 7 female engineers that were in the series. And I don't think that there were any African-American mechanics, but now we have at least 2. So things are changing. So there's actually data out there to say, all right, so 12 years ago there was 1, but now there are 7. So we can only keep moving that forward to having, people like Quentin Washington that works for Team Penske. And you have, Katie and all of her initiatives that she's doing for the Field of Female program saying, hey, you know what, if somebody like me can do this, you can do this too. And I think that's one of the keys, is just for people to be able to see people that look like them working in the industry that we have. It can only get better, right, Marshall?
Well, and I enjoy being someone who motivates others, because I keep hearing people say, Jesus, dude, if you can do this, I know I can do this. I mean, now that I see where the bar is, yeah, I can jump over that one pretty easy. All right, let's move to our last 2 buckets here. This one is fun. It's just pure fun. Used tires. We've got 2 here, both similar veins. We'll go with both. Alan Bandy, who always sends in great stuff, says, Cara, I just bought my first home. What is the best way to get my hands on a used Firestone race tire after an event to make as the centerpiece for his home, office, or racing shrine?
Well, I love the question. That's one of those things that unfortunately we do not give away used race tires. There's a lot of confidential technology that are in our own race tires, and plus they're kind of stinky. After you get a tire that's run a race, it doesn't smell very good. I don't think you want your office smelling like used race tire. But other than that, we have display tires for what we would give to teams that are working on setups, something like that. But a used race tire, we want to make sure that they're disposed of correctly too. And a lot of times you see race tires leaving the track and they ended up in somebody's garbage anyway. So we want to protect our own confidential technology, but we also want to make sure it's disposed of in an environmentally friendly manner.
I do love watching, it's often kids, and not necessarily young kids, but teenagers that I see walking away with, it could be a used Cooper tire, say, discarded from a Road to Indy, car, or, pick any of the other series. But I love, if I happen to be leaving the track at a time where I see a kid walking away with a tire, his arm through a tire or her arm through a tire, just holding on to that over their shoulder, and I'm like, A, you're going to smell, B, you're going to be even dirtier, and I can't wait till your mother or father sees you walk in the door and say, what are you doing?
What are you going to do with that? Where are you going to put that? That's not going in my house. I can hear it right now.
Exactly. So the second question on this thread comes from Zachary Burcham, who says, how many times a weekend does someone ask you for a tire to take home as a souvenir?
that's a perfect follow-up question, Zachary. I love it. So, yeah, we get it a lot. The people that actually work in the mounting and balancing of our tires, the tire mounters, they get that question all the time, probably 10 to 15 times a day. That and how much do race tires cost? Those are the questions we get all the time.
You could almost have a little animatronic, Cara or Lisa Boggs or someone. You can just kind of press the button for the answer you want. And
that's perfect.
All right, well, we've saved some fun ones to close on here, and this is all related to driver feedback. We got a few other ones, which, while I loved, and they probably would have led to a couple of laughs, would also probably led you to have shortened the list of drivers who are happy to see you coming next season. So we've tried to weed some of those out. But we do have a bunch of folks who are curious about styles of feedback and so on. John Miller sent in a question, Tom Schreier, Anthony Ghosh as well. So I'll try and consolidate a couple of their questions into a good closing thread for us here. First one, John asks, is what has been the best feedback you've ever gotten from a driver to tire test?
So there's a lot of great feedback that we've gotten. We are really lucky to be able to do on-track testing with our actual IndyCar drivers. You get some really excellent feedback that goes right into the race weekend. One of the first tire tests I worked with, I think Tony Kanaan was testing. It might have even been Homestead, maybe the Homestead Oval, and he gave me a bit of feedback. I'm trying to act all cool, but he gave me a bit of feedback, and he said, we made a very small construction change in the tire. I'd like to hear what you like to think about this tire. So he goes out and run it, and I'm looking at my notes, minor construction change in the sidewall. Great. So he comes back in, and he says, all right, you've changed the lower sidewall of this tire, and what it does is when I'm transferring the load from the left side tires to the right side tires, I feel this bit of feedback. And I'm there, my first year as an engineer, very green, and I'm hearing him talking about he knows exactly what part of the tire we changed, and I'm trying not to act impressed. I'm like, okay, yeah, small construction change, trying to act all cool. But it was really amazing to me that some of the drivers have the ability to pick out even the part of the tire that might have changed and what effect or what feedback that has on the rest of the car.
What is wrong with you, Kanaan? You're not supposed to be able to feel that. Well, what?
Right.
Dude.
You're stealing our secrets here, Tony.
And so we'll go to the next one from Tom Schreier. And I like this because it points actually to, I think, something that fits your work ethic, which is always striving for perfection. Tom says it'd be interesting to hear some stories about what kind of feedback you might get from drivers in general. And who is the highest maintenance driver, i.e. the one that's never happy? And I don't, at least for me, Cara, I don't receive the second part of Tom's question as a negative, but more as the person who's like, no, if we did this or try that, we can make it even better. So what kinds of general feedback do you get from drivers? 'Cause I guess the average person wouldn't know what you're hearing. Then also, do you have a couple of drivers like, okay, I know I'm in for some hard work today because they really want this to be as good as possible?
So, yeah, we're, again, super lucky. Our Firestone race engineering staff, we are at the races. So our engineers that are actually designing the tires in Akron, Ohio, we're the same ones that are going to the track. So my street course engineer, Anna, she tries to come to all the street courses. And my road course engineer, Corey, comes to the road courses. So we try to make sure that the engineer who's responsible for the tire is always at the track. And then we're always working with the drivers to get that feedback. So we're able to talk to the drivers. And I like feedback regardless of whether the driver is happy or not. And one of my examples of animated feedback, you would never believe who this is, Marshall, but Sebastian Bourdais is always great at telling me exactly what he thinks.
Are you kidding?
But I like that.
When did
Some
this
people
happen?
might take it as a negative because he's always telling you exactly what he feels, but it's unfiltered.
Well,
and I can take that unfiltered feedback, and we can actually continually innovate and improve our tires to make them better year over year.
And let me just interject quickly, whether it's a tire engineer, a race engineer, the last thing you want is to send the car out with a change, whatever it is, set, could be chassis, aero, tire, and have the driver come back and so what did you feel here? That was okay. Oh,
yeah, it's good.
Or what? No, because that you can't write down. Meh. That doesn't help.
That's not helpful. When I started out at Firestone, when I was traveling with the series, before the drivers got to know me, a lot of them assumed that I might be PR. So I learned very quickly how to put my engineer hat on, as opposed to when they started thinking that I was PR, because I got a lot of answers like, "Oh, the Firestone tires are amazing today." I'm like, why does everybody keep telling me the Firestone tires are amazing? Like, I want to know about understeer, exit understeer. That's what I'm trying to figure out from you. Why are you telling me they're amazing? And then I realized that that's what they probably thought, that I was maybe a PR person or looking for a quote. And so then I realized how to tweak my questions to make them understand, okay, no, I'm really actually looking for the unfiltered tire feedback. So that's great. There's, it's interesting. You can get all sorts of feedback, some good feedback. There's some drivers that like to talk in circles. There's some drivers that it might take forever to figure out what they're actually saying. One of my favorites was testing it with, I think it was Dan Weldon at Chicagoland one year, where he kept using the word tippy. I don't know what tippy is. So I'm talking to the engineer, because a lot of times the engineers that have worked with those drivers for a long time, they can translate. So it took me a while to realize, all right, he's talking about a feeling in the front of the car, and he's actually, what that means physically in the tire is this. So it's really interesting to get some of those. But there's all kinds of anywhere from somebody who will talk for 5 minutes about the tire, and by the time you're done with those 5 minutes, you think, I don't even know what that person was trying to tell me about the tires.
Could you give me a thumbs up or thumbs down, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. You said it understeers live in the corner, but then you also said it was loose leaving the corner, in the same corner, in the same lap. So it's really interesting. Most of our IndyCar drivers, in fact, the vast majority of the IndyCar drivers, are just phenomenal work with feedback. They give us great, honest feedback, and it helps us at Firestone just to continue to innovate, make sure that they can count on those tires the next year and that they're even better.
And I'll just throw in quickly, because this might not be something that everybody knows or realizes. Part of your job, which I'm guessing, I don't know how much of it is natural or you had to learn and develop, but part of your job is being a reporter, essentially, right? You can either be the one who asks the questions to Kimi Räikkönen and gets 2 or 3 word mumbles, which does nothing for you, or you can learn how to speak with or interact with each driver, including the Kimi Räikkönen type, who just don't really have much to say but like to drive quickly, and have to figure out how to interview, parse information out if you're not getting what you need, because ultimately, and I realize I'm drawing a parallel between race tire design and engineering and reporting, but the product you're trying to put out is truly based on those people who you are interacting with, to then give, either the reading audience or the fans looking for a good race as high a quality product as possible. So it's not just engineering speak and zeros and ones. You also have to be a pretty darn good reporter to get what you need.
Yeah, that's actually a really great parallel that I've not thought about until now. So a little bit of a reporter, a little bit of a psychologist, a little bit of just really paying attention to your timing. I don't want to ask somebody who just qualified dead last what he thought about the gap between the primary and the alternate tires are right after they get out of the car. I might choose to talk to that person the next day to see, what his thoughts on tire performance were, because a lot of times emotion comes into play, and sometimes it clouds what drivers might say. Also, there are some drivers that might give you team feedback instead of driver feedback. So sometimes with drivers like that, it's good to get to them quickly so you can get that good feedback before they talk to everyone else. And then, like groupthink, if you've talked to everybody else about the tire feedback, then you might give the group answer as opposed to your individual answer. So yes, there's a little bit of psychology, there's a little bit of paying attention to your timing, and there's a little bit about knowing what questions to ask and when to ask them.
Willpower. How do you think your tires feel about you? Now that's one I want you to throw at our favorite crazy Australian. He would probably answer it too. That's the crazy part.
I might have to throw that out sometime this year, and he's going to look at me really strange, and I'm going to say, "Oh, Miss Marshall."
And he'll say, "Yeah, all right." That's
makes
again.
sense now.
All right. Well, I'll save the last question here on this. It's a topic that came in through the driver feedback thread, but I like this because it's just a little bit of a fun, unattached piece. This also is from Anthony Ghosh. So if you are having a free weekend, you're not affiliated with any brand, just you getting to be your fun, creative self, Anthony asks, if you could create tires for any other form of motor racing, not IndyCar obviously, is there one series that intrigues you as a race engineer with tires and designer? Like, ooh, that'd be fun.
Oh man, that's a great question. So for the technical person in me, one project that I had a lot of fun with was the Delta Wing when we were providing tires from that, because we talked with Ben Bowlby initially, and he said he wanted one front tire, and then it was two front tires that are 4 inches wide, and we thought, you want to carry how much load on a tire that's 4 inches wide? Do you understand hoop stress? Do you understand strength? And it was interesting to go through that design process, and it was so outside the box and so outside anything that we had done to come up with a front tire that could carry those sorts of loads with the size it was. So anything that's very different, that's a very different technical challenge, is always something great. I mean, even with IndyCars, the tire size stays the same, but there's a lot of innovation that goes within that window of what you're able to do with that envelope of size constraints. But honestly, something that's very different, something that's it's a very unique challenge. As engineers, we're always driven by those challenges that, nobody else could solve them, so maybe I can solve them. So the Delta Wing is just a great example of something that was just so outside the box, and so you look at it first and you say, nah. But then you start working on it and you're like, oh wait, but if we do this, and what if we tried this construction, and what if we tried this, and you test it. Those kind of projects are really fun.
Cara, you're a gem. You know that. I tell you as often
Thank
as
you.
I can when I see you. You help make our jobs on the media side so much easier, and we can obviously tell you've given us more time than scheduled. We went into overtime for sure, but I guess it would be better than, well, that was a 9-minute Week in IndyCar episode, because no one wants to hear the least bit of stuff from Cara Adams. So thank you again, my friend. Not only do I appreciate the time you've taken, but look forward to hopefully sometime next year maybe having you back on again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Marshall. Much appreciated.